So we're going to be having an institutions versus cypherpunks debate today. We're going to try to keep it quick, but we are going to start with a quick vote, just show of hands. It's just a bit of a casual thing. So if you are watching now in the audience and you believe institutions will control or own the future of Bitcoin, put your hand up. Who of you believes institutions will own or control Bitcoin? All right, so I'm going to eyeball that at about a 15%. What do you guys think? 15%? So does that mean then that everybody else, if you put your hand up, if you believe cypherpunks will own the future of Bitcoin? Hands up. All right, yeah, I'm gonna eyeball that at about an 80%. So let's say 80-20 is the current number. So we're gonna do a vote at the end and see who was able to shift more views. Now we're gonna get straight into it because we don't have a lot of time. So we're gonna do 3 minutes opening arguments on each side per person. We'll have some rebuttals, have a little bit of back and forth, a final statement, and then we'll take a vote at the end. So let's get it going. André, you're gonna take the stand first. And give us your opening argument. You've got 3 minutes on why institutions own Bitcoin's future. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, welcome to BTC Prague. My name is André Dragosch. I'll present the key arguments pro-institutional adoption. So, in my view, Bitcoin's maturity is not betrayal, it's evolution, right? The adoption curve is inevitable, and institutions are the bridge. We are crossing the chasm to hyper-Bitcoinization as we speak. Bitcoin is moving from early adopters to the early majority. This always requires credible, scalable, and risk-managed channels, right? Enter institutions. ETF inflows speak volumes. As of Q2 2025, US spot Bitcoin ETFs have attracted over $80 billion in assets. BlackRock's iBuild holding over 300,000 Bitcoins. Clearly, institutional demand is real and is growing. If Bitcoin was a teenager in 2010, it's now applying for a mortgage. You can rebel in a hoodie, but you still need a bank statement, right? So, second point is institutions bring stability, legitimacy, and liquidity. Institutions help with price discovery, right? Institutional platforms, CME futures, ETFs add transparent price signals. Compare this to shadowy offshore exchanges in 2017, right? Institutions help by dampening volatility and thereby even nurturing further adoption, right? Since the ETF's launch, 30-day Bitcoin's volatility dropped by over 20%, right? Increasing its appeal as a treasury reserve asset. And institutions add credibility, right? Sovereign funds, for instance, Singapore's GIC, Norway's sovereign wealth funds, they're exploring BTC exposure, right? This legitimizes Bitcoin not just as a bet, but as global monetary asset. And I don't think I have more time.
1 minute.
1 minute, okay, perfect. Maybe one last point to add is institutions are essentially Bitcoin's Trojan horse into the monetary system. Right? Wall Street isn't replacing Bitcoin, it's betting on it. Institutions may play by TradFi rules, but Bitcoin changes them from within. The base layer doesn't change, right? Bitcoin scarcity doesn't change. Censorship resistance is still core to mining and protocol rules, right? Bitcoin entered the bank lobby wearing a suit, but it's still carrying a flamethrower under the blazer.
20 seconds left.
And I'll pause here.
20 seconds. Oh, you're done? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, André. All right, so that was the opening argument. Let's now have John Carvalho deliver the opening argument for the cypherpunks. Why will cypherpunks own the future of Bitcoin?
Hello. So, quite simply, adoption of Bitcoin liabilities is not adoption of Bitcoin. When Satoshi created Bitcoin, he created it to try to fix all of the problems that were caused by all of the people that the other side is defending. So if you think about it, Bitcoin loses every single one of its superpowers under custody. So when you give your keys away, not your keys, not your coins, it's gone. You have censorship. You don't have permissionlessness. You don't have limits to the quantity of Bitcoin. You can have inflation. All of the things that make Bitcoin actually valuable, and thus something maybe some people would want to hoard, disappear when you give that Bitcoin and entrust it to someone else. If you want to use, financial institutions, you want to speculate, you don't need Bitcoin to act as some sort of husk to channel all of your leverage or anything like that. Any pile of things can be something you can speculate on, but Bitcoin isn't any pile of things. Bitcoin does have superpowers. It allows anybody to be able to use it without any permission. It allows you to be borderless, it allows you to be self-sovereign, and you can't have any of that with institutions. Further, you have really, really large risks of any type of Bitcoin centralization, whether it be mining, development, including ownership of the coins. If most of the people who value Bitcoin have values that are different than you, then what will Bitcoin behave like in the future? Will it behave in the ways that you want or the ways that they want? They will eventually figure out ways to have influence over development, influence over regulations, and we'll end up with something, if we're lucky, like a white market Bitcoin versus a black market Bitcoin. This can create fork situations, it can create oppressive situations where black market Bitcoin is criminalized, and we might have to go through all of these extra hardships that we're hoping to have to avoid as we create a new world, just because we wanted to support people like Michael Saylor pumping our bags. Unfortunately, in my opinion, most of the motivation and support for institutions is simply this. It's simply thinking, well, these guys are going to make me rich, so I'm going to support them. Great, but you're selling your soul. You can't do that. That's all I have to say.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John. All right, now Giacomo, let's hear your opening argument. 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I think that we have to chill out. Adoption by institution is not really endangering cypherpunk values. And evidence one is that the only person with a suit on this panel is the moderator. So we're supposed to be the institutional ones. Well, evidence two, the institutional side is so desperate that they asked me to be representative of the institutional side. So we are in control, basically. We are in control. So the point is that even if we are always complaining that the cypherpunk value are diluting, yes, they are diluting, but the absolute number of people buying into cypherpunk value compared to 2008 is increasing at an incredible rate. We have a rate, like an internal percentage of cypherpunks versus normies, which is of course shrinking because the mass of normies, which is coming to Bitcoin, is larger than the mass of cypherpunks. But the mass of cypherpunks itself is growing. And what we have to measure here is not really if there is any contamination. Contamination is inevitable. What we have to measure here is the rate of how much the cypherpunk narrative is changing institutions versus how much the institutional narrative is changing the cypherpunks. Now, if I have to think about how many Wall Street guys, Wall Street suits, that are actually exposed to things like censorship resistance, self-custody, even Michael Saylor, yeah, he's calling us paranoid crypto-anarchists, but then he also said in an interview, just come to take my private keys and I may have a boating accident. That's incredible, said by him. Of course, then he had a tax investigation, so he changed his tone a little bit. But that was very, very cool to have this kind of rhetoric penetrating into the institutional side. We, as cypherpunks, are growing in number, and we are infecting the institution more than they are infecting us with the normie thinking. The second point is that institutional wave of adoption could also be beneficial to some degree for Bitcoin. I think that one of the key point that makes Bitcoin strong is resistance to change. And surprisingly, instead of having institutional money trying to change Bitcoin at the protocol level, it seems like right now they are trying to prevent change. Talking about Saylor again, he was complaining about ETFs giving money to core developers because they may tinker with the protocol. I think that's a good thing to have, a force pro-status quo, a force that is against arbitrary change and gives stability not just at the liquidity level, but also at the protocol level. And the last point is that I don't always agree with Eric Voskuil, but there is one thing that he says that I think makes sense to me. Sometimes nation-states are the cypherpunks, meaning that every human organization can act as the oppressor or as the oppressed. And some institutions they actually have more to gain from financial freedom than they have to lose. For example, think about...
I'm going to have to cut you there. Finish your point, and then
I finished the point. Panama, they don't rob citizens with taxes. They mostly just sell the canal. They cannot care less for censorship and printing money because they don't, but they can actually be interested in Bitcoin as a tool for free their nation state from other nation states, which I think is cool.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Giacomo. Francis, you've got 3 minutes.
So I think that the Bitcoin ecosystem evolves around the products that are being used by people, right? So if you think about how Bitcoin has evolved, we have the hardware wallet, the mobile wallet, the mining pool, all sorts of technologies. So the builders of apps and services and protocols and layer, whether that's Lightning, whether that's something else, are the ones that ultimately decide how the Bitcoin experience will change over time. And who is building the tools and the services that people are using on a day-to-day basis when they are holding Bitcoin, when they're spending Bitcoin? It's the cypherpunks. The institutions are not building anything. They are marketing Bitcoin. They are reselling some kind of remote and indirect exposure to Bitcoin, but they're not building anything that people are tangibly using on a day-to-day basis. And what the cypherpunks are doing is that they are infusing their values into their products. And by virtue of these products being used by millions of people worldwide, our cypherpunk values are actually being adopted by the mass of Bitcoin users. So when talking about who controls Bitcoin, I like to think about the Bitcoin experience. And I like to think that the cypherpunks are definitely the people who are in control of the way that people are using Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis. They are building open source software, which will last forever, which is a monument, whereas the institutions are really just marketing vehicles, and they're not having a tangible impact. In terms of controlling the protocol, well, we have a really good example of what a takeover of institutions of the Bitcoin protocol may look like, and that was the fork wars in 2017, where you had, at the time, institutions such as Coinbase and BitPay and Blockchain.info and some venture capital-backed firms that tried to take over the development of the Bitcoin protocol and the way that the Bitcoin protocol was evolving. And they were opposed to, at the time, the cypherpunks. They thought that the cypherpunks were too conservatives, and they thought that the cypherpunks were too strong-headed, and we needed to have something more flexible. And it was the same narrative at the time, that Bitcoin needs to grow up, and Bitcoin needs to scale. And they tried, with the help of miners, with the help of institutions and Wall Street money, to co-opt the Bitcoin network with, with increasing the block size. And what we realize is that you only need a minority of Bitcoin users who have a lot of skin in the game and a lot of soul in the game to act as a intolerant minority to prevent these changes from happening. Simply put, we cypherpunks are willing to die on the hill of protecting Bitcoin decentralization. The suits are not willing to die on this hill at all. They will fold if there is a head-to-head contest every single time, and we have historical evidence to prove it. So the Bitcoin experience, general, they cannot stop Bitcoin from being used as a method of payment. No matter how much noise they put out to say that Bitcoin is not a means of payment, it's actually a store of value, they can't stop us from developing peer-to-peer transactional tools. And Bitcoin is being used as a means of payment all over the world. It doesn't matter if you have CEOs of Wall Street companies that say Bitcoin is not good for payments. It is actually being used for payments. I'm sorry, I run a Bitcoin payments company, and we are processing hundreds of thousands of payments a year in all sorts of countries across the world, also so-called third world countries. So they put out a lot of noise, but the signal is still strong. I know a lot of cypherpunks sometimes feel a little demoralized at seeing the narrative on Twitter being overwhelmingly in favor of the institutions and number go up and all of that. But the signal is still very strong. We've seen it at this conference. There have never been more cypherpunks today. The technology is better today than it was 10 years ago.
Okay, Francis, we'll have to wrap up there. Yep.
I'm done.
Okay, great, fantastic. Thank you, Francis.
Very good.
Okay, sorry guys, I'm just trying to make sure we've got enough time for everything. So, André, let's have your round of rebuttal. Have 2 minutes to refute any points that John and Francis made.
All right. So, I mean, suits adopting Bitcoin, you can generally say Bitcoin isn't captured, right? It's being canonized. Satoshi didn't build a toy, right? He built a monetary black hole. The more institutions adopt it, the more all roads lead to Bitcoin, right? Dollar hegemony weakens. Central banks, they become more under pressure to adopt Bitcoin. And long-term, institutions, they can't own Bitcoin, right? They can't own the protocol. They can play by its rules. You don't control Bitcoin through supply, right? Unlike proof of stake. That's proof of work. Bitcoin was designed this way. So if the protocol is sound, why are we afraid of TradFi guys buying in, right? That's like being afraid of your enemy joining your religion, right? So institutions, they will expand, not erase Bitcoin's use cases, right? Sovereign custody, corporate treasuries enable global reach, right? Institutional grade custody, financial products, they create on-ramps for billions who will never run the node, most likely. Meanwhile, the cypherpunks keep the base layer honest, right? I think that's the fair balance. And yeah, I'll pause it here.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, André.
Thanks.
John, you've got 2 minutes to refute any points that the other side made.
I don't know. I don't really have that much more to say. With the ETFs, you know, a lot of people like to say to me when I speak against these things that Bitcoin is for enemies. Why are you complaining? Anybody can use it. That's the whole one of the values of it. You know, why are you trying to stop them in these kinds of things? These are not really kind of genuine ways to criticize this behavior, because when I am speaking against ETFs or MSTR, things like this, I'm not speaking against that concept. I think anybody should be able to use Bitcoin, and I understand that people will use it in ways that I don't agree with. What I'm speaking against is the evangelism of that behavior, the support of that behavior, the sailor coiners, you know what I mean? These people that are irresponsibly long on master community, this kind of thing. This is basically perpetuating and trying to create a flywheel out of this behavior, and thus that is going to be very unhealthy for Bitcoin. You're trying to inject many, many people that only care about the price of Bitcoin, which means you're going to inject a lot of volatility once they think the top is in. If they see that Sailor can't buy more Bitcoin for some reason, or that MNAV isn't going up, or they feel that the top is in for this cycle, they're going to sell it off. They're not going to hodl. They're going to try to take their profit, and they're going to cause tons of volatility again, because that's all traders can do, is they can introduce volatility. They can't actually provide some kind of service. So I don't think we should support or actively try to perpetuate and make it easier for these people to co-opt Bitcoin, to try to pretend that this is growth of Bitcoin. It's just growth of legacy banking. It's adoption of Bitcoin by legacy banking. It's not adoption of Bitcoin itself. So yeah, I think that we should just stop being so supportive of the behavior.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Giacomo, you have 2 minutes. Go for it.
Okay, I realized that in my first statement I was a little bit weak, because I was a little bit like, it's not so bad. I want to make the point that institutions are Bitcoin's best friend. We do need institutions. Why? Because without institutions stepping in, people will get lazy. If you are an investor, you want a store of value, you will just use an ETF because it plugs very well with your current banking system. You will not care for privacy. You will not use Bitcoin, you will just use an ETF. If you want to pay, you may end up just using a so-called stable coin, which is basically just fiat credit on some fake blockchain. So you get lazy. Why? Because you don't have a reason to get serious, because nobody is hyperinflating your currency and nobody is censoring you. So we need institutions like the Fed to hyperinflate the dollars so that people will stop using these stable coins, because the dollar is not stable, it's inherently very unstable. So the Fed is the best friend of Bitcoin, because they will send the dollar to hyperinflation. And the Bank of International Settlement is Bitcoin's best friend, because they will start to censor any stable coin, and they also will confiscate eventually ETFs and Coinbase money, just like they did with gold in the 30s. Whenever shit hits the fan, a new Roosevelt will confiscate Coinbase sets, and that will basically bankrupt, I think, 95% of the ETFs plus MicroStrategy. So that's the good role of institutions in Bitcoin. That's why we need them, and we should thank them for being here, preparing the road for real Bitcoin maximalism.
You should have stood on that side.
Fantastic. Thank you, Giacomo. Francis, take 2 minutes, please.
I mean, it's really hard to disagree with André and Giacomo. I think a very good point that you just made, Giacomo, is that, and also André, is that institutions adopting Bitcoin doesn't mean that they will have any kind of control over the protocol. And I don't want banks and governments to own Bitcoin. I want sovereign individuals to own Bitcoin because I want people like me to be able to rebuild a future and have the means to do it. But does it actually hurt me that institutions adopt Bitcoin? Not at all. If BlackRock and MicroStrategy and the US government hold 2 million, 3 million, 4 million Bitcoins, does that mean that they're able to change the protocol? No. Does that mean that they're able to lobby for Bitcoin regulations which hurt the cypherpunks? Maybe, but that's already happening anyway. The governments are going to crack down on cypherpunk technologies whether or not the institutions adopt it or not. Luckily, we have the capacity to build tools with open source software to circumvent and to avoid and to fight back against these kinds of attacks on the Bitcoin network. I think to John's point also, what is sad to me is that back in the day when there was no institutional vehicles for Bitcoin, the path of the Bitcoiner was, I want to make a lot of money really quickly, so I'm going to buy Bitcoin just because the number will go up. And as the number goes up, I start to read books. I start to go on Twitter. I start to learn about cypherpunk principles. I start to learn about self-custody, and then I take self-custody of my Bitcoin, and then I start to learn about privacy, and then I learn about privacy tools. And this is the natural path of the Bitcoiner that's been the path of the Bitcoiner for the past 15 years. But if we have the mindset of saying, well, the people, they're too stupid and they're too incompetent to self-custody, so let's just sell them MicroStrategy shares. The path of the Bitcoiner ends there, and they never get to go deeper into the path. So I think it's more of a missed opportunity. And the idea that people are not sophisticated enough to own their own money, so we should introduce them to ETFs and MicroStrategy, is incredibly paternalistic. Everybody is able to, not everybody, but a lot of people, most people are able to self-custody. Your parents are able to self-custody. Your grandparents are able to self-custody. At Bull Bitcoin, we're a non-custodial exchange. We have grandmothers who are setting up cold cards. It is possible to do. It takes 1 or 2 hours. Let's stop being lazy and pushing people towards MicroStrategy just because we're afraid that they're going to lose their coins. Let's spend a little bit of time to educate people and help them set up self-custody. Let's have faith in the capacity of people to have the willingness and the capacity to take individual responsibility. So driving people towards MicroStrategy and ETFs and all these things because it's an easier path for them to buy into Bitcoin and pump our bags. That's being lazy, and we need to take the hard path. Nothing easy yields very good results. We need to just put a little bit more effort in education and stop, as John said, I don't want to do anything against the institutions. I don't want to stop them from buying Bitcoin. I can't. Bitcoin is free and open source. They can do whatever they want. I just don't want to encourage people towards this path. I prefer to encourage them towards the path of individual sovereignty and independence.
Excellent. Thank you, Francis. Okay, so now we've got a little bit of time for some back and forth. I'm going to encourage our debaters to maybe challenge each other. So maybe André or Giacomo, do you perhaps have a challenge question for the other side? Or something that you'd like to push them on?
No, I just think NGU number go up is actually an essential part of adoption, right? Because why should you be economically incentivized to adopt Bitcoin if it doesn't increase in price, right?
Because of all the qualities that it has, permissionlessness, et cetera, that there's a limited amount, that it can't be inflated and thus undermined. That's the reason. You use Bitcoin for its qualities. I don't think you need that aspect. No,
I think you're right in a way that NGU is part of the Bitcoin security model, because if the price goes up, more people are buying Bitcoin, Bitcoin is being diversified in a wider base. More people are mining Bitcoin. There's more economic nodes in the network. So NGU is, to a large degree, part of the Bitcoin security model. But NGU has happened and can happen and will happen without financial instruments which provide indirect exposure to Bitcoin. So NGU can happen. Rich people can buy $50 million worth of Bitcoin and store it on a cold card. You don't necessarily need MicroStrategy or ETFs to have NGU. And I mean, look at like the last 6 months. I mean, there's been how many hundreds of thousands of Bitcoins bought by these treasury companies. NGU hasn't really risen more than it has in the past. So the correlation between NGU and Bitcoin's properties, I believe in. The correlation between institutional Wall Street adoption of Bitcoin via these indirect mechanisms and NGU, doubtful.
I want to reinforce this point. Institutional adoption on one side means new demand, unlocking new demand, but on the other side, with all the paper Bitcoin, also means unlocking new supply. So it also dilutes Bitcoin to a certain degree because you create paper Bitcoin. So it's basically overall neutral probably, but I totally agree with André and with Francis that what we need is to push back against anti-cypherpunk narratives, but not by pushing back against NGU. NGU is a part of Bitcoin, and saving is a part of Bitcoin, maximalism is a part of Bitcoin. For example, when you encourage people to do saving, you are not encouraging them to bypass the cypherpunk ideals, because one of the activities on Earth that are more regulated, censored, and with more exclusion is saving. So saving is a very cypherpunk activity. Permissionless saving is as important and maybe more important than permissionless payment. So the fact that Bitcoin should be able to do payments and savings is true, but it's very wrong, in my opinion, to try to go against the normal ambition of humans to try to store value for the future. The store of value narrative is a fundamental part of the Bitcoin ethos.
Well, I'll paint myself into my own corner then, because I'll be against NGU here. Obviously, I'm not against it in the sense that all I own is Bitcoin, and thus I am speculating, just like everybody else, to some degree, that this is a better strategy than holding something else long term, right? And so I do believe that the price will go up. So that aspect of NGU is, I concede. But the issue is that, like, the Bitcoin economy can be any size, it can grow, it can shrink, and none of us have any ability to predict the future of the price. And there are lots of things that can affect supply and demand of Bitcoin, interest in Bitcoin, the current confidence of Bitcoiners, the current confidence of people interested in Bitcoin. These are all just economic concepts that Bitcoin does not transcend. Like, the Bitcoin price can go down and stay down a very long time. It can go up, and it can go up really, really, really hard and reach a whole new level we never could have imagined. But these are all just predictions. These are not guarantees. Any amount of NGU being guaranteed mostly relies on the naive interpretation of hyper-Bitcoinization, which says everything, all value, will just black hole entirely into Bitcoin eventually. But I don't think that's rational either. I think that we're always going to have multiple options. People are always going to want alternatives as investments, as monies, et cetera. Maybe Bitcoin could become the most popular, like replace the dollar or something like that. But this is all speculation. It's just all prediction. There's nothing in the protocol that makes that happen or guaranteed. It's just our interest. It's our hope.
You know what's funny? I think adoption number go up, and like dilution, monetary debasement, these macro factors, they're both, different sides of the same coin. Because what we've seen, like some examples, so there's a study by, I think it was BIS, they analyzed different emerging markets, right? And crypto download apps like Coinbase app, exchange apps, and so on, and the price of Bitcoin, right? And actually, these downloads, they lack performance. Means adoption doesn't drive price, but price drives adoption. So the key takeaway from the study is, listen. So the key takeaway from the study is you need to have NGU for further adoption. If you want hyper-Bitcoinization, you need to have NGU at some point. Bitcoin works because of economic incentives, and I think this is one of the key economic incentives, right?
Yeah.
No, and I really don't want to debate the point that NGU is not a key part of Bitcoin. I think what bothers me more about so-called institutional adoption is it's not the ETFs and it's not the fidelities. It's really the new meta of these Bitcoin treasury companies, which sound a lot to me like shitcoiners in the sense that they're taking the brand of Bitcoin, right, which is the brand of Bitcoin, which is pristine and spotless and everybody loves it, and they're selling something that's just like Bitcoin but better. And this is what the shitcoiners have been doing for the last 15 years. They're saying, like, my coin is like Bitcoin, but it's different. It's a super Bitcoin, and it's a hyper Bitcoin, and it's a Bitcoin that gives you more money for your money than Bitcoin. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to capture the interest and attention market for Bitcoin to their thing instead of just selling UTXOs. They say, don't buy a UTXO, buy a super stock in my company, which will give you more yield than the UTXO. And what I'm afraid that they might start to do, is how the shitcoiners have been doing their marketing, is they're going to start to FUD Bitcoin UTXO ownership in order to sell their own thing. So as long as they don't do that, they can do their thing. If they're starting to say Bitcoin is bad for payments, actually don't use Bitcoin for payments. If they're starting to say that the dollar will never go away, people will use stable coins for payments instead of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually not really good for payments. Stop looking at Bitcoin payments technologies. Don't invest in Bitcoin payment startups. Invest in my Bitcoin treasury company instead. And then what they're doing is they're draining resources, right? So they're draining talent that could be going into Bitcoin, real Bitcoin, I call them UTXOs, but real Bitcoin, either startups or products or services or buying, and they're diverting that to Bitcoin treasury companies, or they're, the people who would normally buy UTXOs are being offered this super investment vehicle instead. I find that narrative to be very annoying and very cringy. So it's not that they can hurt Bitcoin, it's that they can divert, potential Bitcoin sovereign ownership into something else, which is, essentially what the shitcoiners have been doing, and it's why I've been battling shitcoiners, is because I see them as diverting attention and resources away from Bitcoin. I don't think the shitcoiners can hurt Bitcoin. I don't think the institutions can hurt Bitcoin. I just think that they are causing people to lose out on something, which is Bitcoin ownership, by proposing them something else and marketing it as something which is also like very, very scammy. Like the narrative that we're seeing for these Bitcoin treasury companies is super scammy. What they're doing is they're doing these Wall Street reverse takeover kind of pump and dump schemes, and they're orange washing their fiat scams with the Bitcoin brand. And my only real concern is that they're damaging Bitcoin's brand by promoting these scams and using the Bitcoin brand to promote these penny stock pump and dumps.
This is a very important. A very important point that I think should buy some, if not sympathy, basically some slack to the real enemies like the Fed, the nation states, the Bank of International Settlement, the IMF, because they are the enemy of Bitcoin, the natural enemy of Bitcoin. But they are a very clear enemy. Bitcoin's values are in clear antithesis to those values. They want to print and they want to censor. We want a stable supply and we want freedom of transaction and privacy. So it's very clear what is the battlefield here. And they cannot confuse people. They can only win or lose, and I hope they will lose and we will win. But they are a clear enemy. While the proximity scams of the false friends, that's more dangerous in the short term for dilution of the effort and of the mindset. So Francis before mentioned the block size wars. In the block size wars, we didn't have governments and Wall Street on the other side. We had all these blockchain, shitcoin, crypto companies, and even now, if you have anybody trying to take over a protocol, that's usually not coming from the IMF or the World Economic Forum. That's usually somebody that will market themselves as very close to Bitcoin. Maybe they will say they run some Bitcoin magazine, I don't know, some Bitcoin conference, just example. And they will pretend to be very close to Bitcoin in order to use this ambiguity to really inject contradictory values from within and from beside you. While the real, I respect more a clear enemy than a false friend.
I think I disagree. I want to add nuance to one aspect there.
Sorry, guys, we've got about a minute left, so do you want to just take a last sort of 30 seconds and kind of make your closing argument here? Because we're going to have to close down.
Sure. You can't separate state from institutions. So any attempt to view it that way is going to be incorrect and naive, because we all know that these institutions, particularly the ones we're talking about today, are operating within a government-sanctioned marketplace. So the government ultimately decides what they can and can't do with those securities. And so they can redefine that and change it in the future.
I agree. It's just that shitcoiners are worse right now in the cultural battle than the clear enemy of the state.
I don't even see shitcoiners anymore.
All right, well, I think that's just about all we've got time for. So just before we finish, we're going to take a final vote. So for those of you, you've had a chance to listen to the arguments from both sides. So hands up if you side with John and Francis on the Cypherpunk side. Hands up. It's probably 80. I'm going to eyeball that at 85%. What do you guys think? Yeah? All right, now, hands up if you side with Giacomo and André and you think institutions are going to own Bitcoin's future. Hands up. I'm going to say that's about a 10%, 5 to 10%.
Guys, we tried to tell you to stop.
Yeah, so look, actually, I'm going to, as the moderator, I'm going to hand the victory to, the W goes to John and Francis. So congratulations. So well done. And a valiant effort from the institutional side, the suit coiners. But that's all we have time. So for everyone, please put your hands together for our debate participants.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Thanks.
Well fought, well fought.
Thanks, John.
Secure your BTC Prague 2026 ticket at the lowest possible price now.